This is already underway. Not announced, not debated, not negotiated. Over the last 48 hours, silver shipments that normally clear without friction have begun stalling. Licenses delayed, allocations revised, intermediate forms quietly reclassified, no press conference, no official countdown, just a sudden change in how metal moves and who it moves to. Inside supply chains, the message landed immediately. Procurement desks adjusted orders. Compliance teams froze outbound commitments. Manufacturers recalculated run rates before markets even noticed anything was wrong. This wasn't a trade dispute. It was a switch being flipped. China has already moved. Silver is no longer being treated as a commodity. It has been repositioned as leverage. The first sign wasn't price. It never is. Spot screens stayed calm, charts looked ordinary, but behind those screens, continuity assumptions started breaking. Components that were expected to arrive on schedule became conditional. Deliveries that were routine became subject to review. Contracts that assumed uninterrupted flow suddenly didn't. That's when tech companies began reacting internally. Not with press statements, with contingency calls, with inventory audits, with quiet instructions to secure material before conditions tightened further. Because, for modern technology, silver isn't optional. It's embedded, it's consumed. And once it stops flowing, production doesn't slow, it stops. This is what makes the move so effective. Export bans don't need headlines to work. They don't need to shock investors. They only need to interrupt timing. A few weeks of friction is enough to force decisions that can't be undone cheaply. China understands this dynamic. Control the flow and the response rights itself. Buyers pull forward demand. Inventories drain faster. Competition for allocation intensifies. And suddenly, what looked like a stable input becomes a bottleneck with no immediate workaround. This is not about silver going higher today. It's about silver becoming unavailable tomorrow. And when continuity breaks, price is always the last signal, not the first. Silver isn't valuable because it's rare. It's valuable because modern systems cannot function without it. Every advanced circuit depends on it. Semiconductors use silver for precision contacts. Electric vehicles rely on it for power management and thermal stability. Energy grids require it for high-efficiency switching. Data centers and AI hardware consume it continuously to move electricity with minimal loss. In each case, silver isn't decorative. It's functional. Remove it, and performance degrades immediately or fails outright. That's what turns silver into a choke point. Substitution sounds simple on paper. Use copper, use aluminum, use composites. In reality, those alternatives introduce resistance, heat, signal loss, or reliability problems that compound at scale. A prototype might tolerate it. A mass production system cannot. At industrial volumes, silver isn't a preference. It's a requirement. This is where assumptions start breaking. Most people believe there are vast silver stockpiles waiting to be tapped. There aren't. Unlike gold, silver is consumed. Once it's embedded into electronics, solar panels, and infrastructure, it doesn't come back to market. Recycling is slow, inefficient, and economically marginal at current recovery rates. What's been used is effectively gone. That means inventories are thinner than they appear, and far smaller than demand suggests. Export controls exploit this mismatch perfectly. They don't announce a shortage. They create rationing without using the word. Material still exists. It just becomes harder to access, slower to clear, and conditional on approval. Allocation replaces availability. Timing replaces price. Factories feel this immediately. They don't wait for spot prices to spike. They track delivery certainty. When certainty weakens, behavior changes. Orders are pulled forward. Safety stock targets are raised. Suppliers are pressured quietly. None of this shows up in headlines, but it drains inventory faster than any speculative rush ever could. This is why export control is more powerful than a ban. A ban shocks markets, control reshapes behavior, and silver is uniquely vulnerable to this approach because the buffer doesn't exist. There is no strategic reserve large enough to absorb prolonged disruption. There is no rapid supply response. Mining output can't be turned up on command. Refining capacity can't expand overnight. Time is the missing variable. China understands this leverage because of where it sits in the chain, not just as a producer, but as a processor, refiner, and gatekeeper of intermediate forms that global manufacturing depends on. Control doesn't require dominance of the resource. It requires dominance of the flow. That asymmetry is the real risk. The leverage doesn't come from owning the mines. It comes from controlling what happens after the metal leaves the ground. Raw silver is rarely used in its mined form. It must be refined, processed, alloyed, and converted into intermediate products before it ever reaches a factory. Pastes, powders, films, contacts, coatings, these are the forms that actually enter supply chains. And this is where control concentrates. Over the last 2 decades, processing capacity consolidated quietly. Refining, chemical treatment, precision fabrication. Step by step, the critical middle of the chain narrowed. Western manufacturers optimized for efficiency, not redundancy. They assumed uninterrupted throughput. It worked, until continuity became conditional. Today, many of the components that power global manufacturing pass through Chinese processing at some stage. Even when the silver itself originates elsewhere, it often returns in finished or semi-finished form. Contracts were built around this reality. Delivery schedules assumed normal clearance. Penalty clauses assumed delay, not denial. That assumption is now fragile. This is why the disruption doesn't look dramatic at first. Containers still move, customs still clears some shipments. Nothing appears banned in the traditional sense. But approval's slow, documentation expands, classifications change, intermediate products fall into new categories that require review. That's enough. Western firms don't feel this as a policy announcement. They feel it as timing risk, missed delivery windows, partial shipments, components arriving just late enough to disrupt synchronized production. Assembly lines are designed for precision. They don't tolerate uncertainty well. Every delay forces a choice. Pause output, reroute sourcing, or pay up for priority allocation if it exists. None of these options are cheap, and none are scalable when many firms act at once. This is where asymmetry becomes visible. China doesn't need to stop all exports. It only needs to introduce friction at key processing nodes. That friction multiplies downstream. What starts as a paperwork issue becomes a scheduling problem. What starts as a scheduling problem becomes a production pause. And production pauses cascade. Contracts assumed continuity because continuity was the norm. Just-in-time systems were built on it. Inventory buffers were reduced because throughput was reliable. That efficiency now becomes exposure. When flow slows, there's no slack. This is not a ban you notice at customs. It's a disruption you notice on the factory floor. And once a line pauses, restarting it isn't instant. Equipment must be recalibrated. Labor schedules shift. Downstream commitments break. Costs compound faster than material prices ever could. That's the leverage, not ownership, not headlines. Flow. The first real damage doesn't show up in markets. It shows up on the factory floor. Modern production lines are built for continuity, not interruption. Components arrive in sequence. Machines are calibrated to exact inputs. Schedules are synchronized across suppliers, logistics, and labor. When a single material fails to arrive on time, the line doesn't slow down gracefully. It halts. Silver is one of those materials. A delayed shipment doesn't mean waiting a few days and picking up where things left off. Lines must be shut down safely. Systems must be powered down in stages. Partially completed units often can't be finished later and are scrapped. Labor still has to be paid. Commitments to downstream customers still exist. The cost of stopping dwarfs the cost of paying more for raw material. That's why manufacturers don't wait it out. When supply becomes uncertain, procurement teams are instructed to secure material at almost any price. The decision isn't financial, it's operational. A factory that stops for a week can lose months of output through cascading delays. Restarting requires recalibration, testing, and requalification. In regulated industries, that process alone can take weeks. This is where demand becomes inelastic. Buyers stop optimizing for price and start optimizing for certainty. They pull forward orders, they increase safety stock targets, they accept unfavorable terms if it guarantees delivery. These decisions are made quietly, long before markets react. And once enough buyers behave this way, available inventory drains rapidly. That's when hoarding begins. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. Suppliers respond by rationing. Large orders are split. Lead times stretch. Priority is given to long-term relationships or strategic clients. Everyone else is told to wait. This creates a feedback loop. The more buyers sense scarcity, the faster they move to secure what's left. The faster they move, the scarcer it becomes. None of this requires a headline shortage. A few delayed shipments are enough to trigger defensive behavior across an entire sector. Once production managers experience a near miss, they don't assume conditions will normalize. They assume disruption will worsen, and they act accordingly. This is why export controls are so effective in industrial markets. They don't need to eliminate supply. They only need to make it unreliable. Reliability is what keeps just-in-time systems alive. Remove it, and efficiency turns into fragility. By the time prices respond, the real decisions have already been made. Inventory has been pulled forward. Allocations have been locked up. And those without secured supply are already planning downtime. This is the point where the problem stops being about silver itself and starts being about systems. Because once enough factories shift into protection mode, no market mechanism can quickly rebalance the shock. This is where markets are supposed to step in, and this is where they start to fail. Financial markets are designed to smooth shocks when supply is flexible. Futures exist to distribute risk, stabilize prices, and allow participants to plan. That framework works only if physical delivery remains an option that everyone trusts. When that trust weakens, price discovery gives way to system stress. Silver is now pressing directly on that fault line. On paper, the market looks deep. Open interest is large. Liquidity appears abundant. But most of that liquidity represents claims, not metal. Futures, ETFs, and unallocated accounts multiply exposure to silver far beyond the amount that can actually be delivered. That imbalance stays invisible as long as most participants are content to settle in cash. Export disruption changes that behavior. When factories face continuity risk, paper exposure stops being sufficient. Buyers want assurance, not mark-to-market gains. They begin requesting physical allocation, longer delivery guarantees, or conversion into metal they can control. The moment enough participants do this at once, the mismatch becomes obvious. Delivery assumptions start to break. This is not theoretical. It has happened before. Palladium in the early 2000s, nickel more recently, energy markets during supply shocks. In each case, contracts that functioned smoothly under normal conditions became unstable when too many participants reached for physical fulfillment at the same time. Exchanges were forced into uncomfortable decisions. Those decisions are always defensive. Margin requirements rise abruptly. Position limits tighten. Delivery rules are adjusted. Cash settlement language becomes more prominent. These measures are framed as risk management, but they don't restore confidence. They signal that the system is under strain, and once that signal is sent, behavior shifts again. Participants reduce exposure not because prices are high, but because outcomes become uncertain. Hedgers shorten duration. Traders step back. Those who truly need metal move earlier and more aggressively. Volatility increases, not because of speculation, but because the market is losing its ability to intermediate between paper and physical smoothly. This is how markets stop working, quietly at first. Price stops being the primary coordinator. Availability takes over. Transactions become harder to execute without concessions. Spreads widen. Liquidity fragments. What remains tradable is no longer representative of what's usable. Defensive responses amplify the problem. By trying to preserve function, exchanges constrain flexibility. By constraining flexibility, they push more participants towards securing physical outside the system. That drains confidence further. The feedback loop tightens. From the outside, it still looks orderly. Screens update, trades clear, headlines lag. But inside the system, the nature of risk has changed. The question is no longer, what is silver worth? It becomes, will this contract perform as expected? When that question enters the market, normal price behavior breaks down. And that's why the most significant damage doesn't coincide with the largest price move. It happens earlier, while prices still look manageable, and while participants are quietly repositioning around a reality the charts haven't reflected yet. What you see on the screen is not the market. It's the lag. Spot prices are summaries. They are averages of what traded under conditions that no longer exist. They update after decisions are made, after allocations are secured, after inventories move. By the time price reacts, the behavior that caused it has already locked in. That's the price lie. Inside procurement channels, reality looks different. Buyers don't reference spot when continuity is at risk. They reference availability. They ask who can deliver, how fast, and under what conditions. Premiums become flexible. Allocation becomes negotiated. Delivery windows matter more than benchmarks. This disconnect widens quietly. Official prices can remain calm while physical terms deteriorate. Dealers quote market while limiting quantities. Large orders are split or delayed. Some suppliers stop quoting altogether unless terms are renegotiated. None of this shows up on a chart. It shows up in emails, calls, and revised contracts. Rationing rarely announces itself. It appears as inconvenience first. A longer lead time, a smaller allocation, a requirement to commit earlier, a request for prepayment. Each change seems manageable on its own. Together, they signal that the buffer is gone. Once buyers recognize that pattern, behavior shifts immediately. They move before price does. Orders are pulled forward. Safety stock targets rise, alternatives are explored, even if they're inferior. Buyers accept worse economics to secure certainty. This surge in demand happens while spot prices still look contained. It drains inventory without triggering headlines. That's why official prices stay calm until they don't. When spot finally responds, options disappear quickly. Suppliers have already committed remaining inventory. Allocations are locked. New buyers face worse terms, or none at all. Price moves violently not because demand suddenly appeared, but because supply was already exhausted. Charts tell you what happened. They don't tell you what's possible next. By the time price spikes, the decision space collapses. Participants who waited for confirmation are forced to react under worse conditions. Those who moved earlier secured material at terms that are no longer available. This is why surface-level signals mislead. Markets report price. Industries operate on continuity. When those diverge, the screen lies by omission, and this divergence doesn't hurt everyone equally. Metals investors can choose exposure. They can wait, they can reduce risk. Tech manufacturers can't. Their exposure is embedded in products already in production. They don't get to step aside when conditions tighten. They have to secure material or stop output. That asymmetry determines who feels the impact first. Step back and look at the number the system is now orbiting: $5 trillion. That's That's the approximate value of the technology stack that depends, directly and continuously, on silver flow. Not as an input you can swap out, as material embedded so deeply that removing it breaks functionality across entire sectors. Artificial intelligence hardware, electric vehicles, power grids, data centers, defense systems, telecommunications. These industries don't consume silver once. They consume it every day, at scale across thousands of production lines that were designed under one assumption: uninterrupted access. That assumption is gone. What makes this exposure dangerous isn't just size, it's simultaneity. All of these sectors are scaling at the same time. All of them are capital intensive. All of them are politically sensitive. And all of them now compete for the same constrained input under conditions that can be solved by price alone. This is not optional demand. An AI data center doesn't delay a build because silver is expensive. A grid upgrade doesn't pause because margins tighten. Defense procurement doesn't slow because supply chains are inconvenient. These systems move forward regardless of cost because stopping carries higher risk than overpaying. That's why this isn't cyclical. In a normal commodity cycle, demand responds to price. Here, demand responds to necessity. Higher prices don't shut factories down fast enough to restore balance. They simply expose how little slack exists. And when multiple sectors behave this way simultaneously, competition for allocation intensifies. Export controls remove the political off-ramp. Once material flow becomes a strategic tool, negotiations change. Companies can't lobby their way out of physics. Governments can't mandate substitution that doesn't exist at scale. Supply chains can't reroute instantly when processing and intermediate forms are constrained. What's left is adaptation under pressure. Capital gets reallocated. Projects get prioritized. Some builds move forward while others are quietly delayed or canceled. Not because demand disappeared, but because access became selective. Winners are chosen by allocation, not innovation. This is how systemic risk forms without a crash. There is no single failure point. No dramatic collapse, just a series of constrained decisions that compound over time. Missed timelines, deferred capacity, rising costs absorbed quietly until they can't be anymore. By the time this shows up as a headline problem, the shape of the outcome is already set. History has seen this phase before. When critical inputs shift from market goods to strategic constraints, behavior changes first, prices follow. And the adjustment that comes next is rarely smooth or temporary. This is not collapse, not yet. What's happening now is adaptation under pressure, and that distinction matters. When a material crosses from being a market input to a strategic constraint, systems don't fail all at once. They bend, they reroute, they harden in places and fracture in others. Stockpiling begins quietly. Not panic buying, strategic accumulation. Companies that can afford to move early do so. Those that can't start planning around delay. Governments respond next, but slowly. Reshoring initiatives are announced. New refining capacity is proposed, alternative supply chains are studied, capital is redirected toward redundancy instead of efficiency. These moves create headlines, but they don't create relief. Not quickly. Time is the missing variable. Building processing capacity takes years. Qualifying new suppliers takes longer. Re-engineering components to reduce silver intensity takes multiple design cycles, if it's possible at all. None of this happens on a quarterly timeline. Meanwhile, demand doesn't pause. AI deployment continues. Grid upgrades continue. Defense procurement continues. The system moves forward while adaptation lags behind. That gap is where volatility lives, not the kind driven by speculation, the kind driven by constraint. Prices swing because availability fluctuates. Terms change because allocations shift. Confidence ebbs and flows as participants adjust expectations in real time. This volatility doesn't burn out quickly because it isn't fueled by excess. It's fueled by necessity. This is why normal behavior doesn't return on its own. Once silver is treated as a strategic material, every decision around it changes. Buyers stop assuming abundance. Sellers stop assuming liquidity. Contracts are written differently. Inventories are managed differently. Risk models are updated to reflect physical limits rather than historical averages. Markets can adapt to this reality, but they can't erase it. The key takeaway is simple, even if the implications are not. Silver has crossed a line. It is no longer just an asset traded for return. It is a resource secured for continuity. And once a market enters that phase, price alone cannot resolve the imbalance. Outcomes widen, assumptions break. Stability becomes conditional. This is not something that ends with a chart pattern or a pullback. It ends when new capacity exists, new processes are proven, and new trust is built into the system. Until then, behavior remains defensive and volatility remains a feature, not a bug. The export controls are not the story, they are the trigger. The story is how a modern economy reacts when one of its quiet foundations stops behaving like it always has. And that process, once started, does not move in reverse simply because the price feels uncomfortable.